Hello and welcome to Oxford University Linguistics Society's second event for Trinity Term 2021. We are here with Professor Heidi Harley from the University of Arizona. She does a lot of work on syntax, morphology, their interface, and lexical semantics, and we're going to be getting into all of those with questions about distributed morphology. So it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for inviting me.
So we'll jump right in with what is distributed morphology?
Distributed morphology is a sort of top to bottom model of grammar. If you are just a syntactician, you might often just hand off the nitty gritty of morphological realization to some other theory. If you are a morphologist, you might not be thinking too hard about whether your proposals mesh well with any particular syntactic framework. Distributed morphology takes you from lexical selection and syntactic building all the way to realization and phonology within a minimalist sort of conception of how the grammar is organized. So it enables you to do a complete understanding of all, syntax, semantics, and morphology, or a complete model of it, not a complete understanding of it.
Brilliant, thank you. It's really interesting for us to hear about different theories and everything. Oxford stays very much within one framework, so it's super exciting to hear different approaches that otherwise we might not come across. So thank you for that. So one of the areas that we've come across a sort of debate with in the distributed morphology sphere is the issue with lexicalism. And we're wondering if you could expand on that and if you think these issues are conceptual, methodological, or empirical.
So this is a great question, especially coming from a place that focuses on a kind of strongly lexicalist model like LFG. LFG and distributed morphology have more in common than you might think, given that both of them are, as I say, kind of top to bottom theories. They give you angles to work when you're looking at problems in any of those structural subdomains of language. Distributed morphology takes at its heart the idea that the word building operations and the sentence building operations are the same set of operations, namely syntactic operations. So just as a minimalist would say that you build a sentence by merging primitive elements together to build a hierarchical structure. Within a distributed morphology framework, those elements are sub-word abstract feature bundles. And so you build them, you make a structure that has hierarchical structure to it that meets all of the sort of syntactic rules that the language has for relating pieces of the structure to each other in various ways. And then you hand it over to the morphological component. And it's only at that point that sort of elements that are relevant for word size building come into the picture or not. So it's only at that point that you know whether you're going to be strongly, agglutinating polysynthetic language with many pieces to your individual phonological words, or whether you're going to be an isolating language where you just basically have word size units that are monomorphemic in the sort of classical sense. So that aspect, there are two slogans. We've got slogans. There are two slogans for distributed morphology. One is syntax all the way down, which refers to the first piece that I described, where you build all your structure using merge. And the other is late insertion. So you don't bring phonological material to the table until you basically have all the structure or sub piece of the structure that you're working on built. And then you start going to your list 2, where you go and you get a bunch of phonological material and you try to find the best representation for that syntactic structure. in a kind of a competition, Paninian sort of a way, you could think of that piece as kind of an optimization of the phonological realization of the structure if you are sort of representationally inclined, optimality theoretically inclined. But that's not the way DM models that piece. DM models that piece in a very rule-based formalism that's kind of classic SPE style formalism. Here's a structure, here's a phonological piece. Is this phonological piece going to be a good competitor to realize that structure? So they kind of compete in a classic Paninian, Kasperskyan kind of a way. The sort of strong anti-lexicalist piece of distributive morphology has to do with that overall architecture, such that in a classical idea of what a lexical item is, you have a syntactic piece, a semantic piece, and a phonological piece, which form a kind of a triple. That's your lexical item. In distributive morphology, there's no single piece of the grammar that is that three-way piece. So the syntactic and semantic subparts of it, subparts of a lexical item, are linked in list 1. So you have a whole bunch of syntactico-semantic formatives that have the syntactic and semantic parts of the representation. Those are the input to the structure building merge-based piece. Then you have another list, which basically matches syntactic parts and phonological parts. That's a separate list called the vocabulary, where you have, so if you think about your sort of LFG representation, where you have like a syn, sem, phon matrix, the syn, sem part of the matrix is in list 1. The syn, phon part of the matrix is in list 2. And that's what competes to realize the structure, those little bits. And then you have this third list called list 3, where there is basically a syn, sem part that includes the truth conditions for the pieces. So you think of the truth conditions as the analog to the phonological realization on list 2. And list 3, you have a syntactic piece and a semantic piece that tells you, yeah, in this context, I'm going to have the following truth conditions. And both the semantic context and the phonological context for list 2 and list 3 can be kind of large or small. So you could have something that's monomorphemic, where, monomorphemic in quotes, where you have just one little phonological piece that corresponds to one little syntactic feature. That would be a normal element of list 2, but you could also have a little phonological piece that is sensitive to a whole bunch of other properties of the structure around it. That would be some complicated allomorph of something that is with a special realization in a special morphophonological context. Analogously, you could have in list 3, you could have a little syntactic piece and a little truth conditional interpretation of that piece, model theoretic truth conditional interpretation of that piece. That would be like a purely compositional element that just whenever you run into it, it contributes the same truth conditions over and over and over again. And you kind of recognize, yeah, that piece contributes plurality or something like that. Analogously, you could have a little syntactic chunk whose truth conditions are very dependent on the structure that's around them. So they could yield a peculiar interpretation in some specific context. That, is sort of, there's debate about whether this is the right way to cut the pie or not, but you could think of those kinds of things as idioms. So you have a special truth condition when, the noun phrase, the bucket is next to you. And so that brings in the sort of way you do kind of these non-strictly compositional. They are strictly compositional, but they're strictly compositional in a very specific conditioned way. That's all part of list 3. So the anti-lexicalist part is the fact that you take the syn-sem parts, you take the syn-phon parts, and you take the other kinds of semantic parts, and you split them up into these three lists of items, which interface with the structure in different ways. So that's the way in which lexicalism is not a part of the model, and that the sort of primacy of the word is denied or lived without.
Thanks. So I think you touched on it a little bit, but where's linguistic variation to be explained? Those sorts of things are often described as all within the lexicon. Is that still held in DM?
So I would say no. Could you give me an example of the particular kind of variation that you're thinking of? Like there's a lot, so variation between speakers, variation within speakers, allomorphic variation,
I meant
interpretive variation.
Yeah, I meant between languages. So if the generative procedure to put stuff together is doing all the work, why does it look different in one language?
So since the true morphology is couched within a strongly minimalist kind of view of how the syntax works, the way in which particularly syntactic variation is dealt with cross-linguistically has a lot to do with the particular elements in list one. So in that sense, that kind of variation is lexical in that it's the elements that are input to the combinatoric system that tell you how the combinatoric system is going to build something. It's not lexical in the sense that those elements don't have any phonological content. So they're not words in any normal idea of what a word is. But it's strongly minimalist in that you do try to put all the conditioners of variation into that list one batch. And so then the syntax is going to come along. In a minimalist framework, syntax is not supposed to do anything super fancy. It's just going to look and see, can I put these two things together? Does one select for the other, which is modeled in terms of featural match of some kind? If I have this element, do I have to move it to validate a feature against some higher functional head? All of that piece of it, actually, insofar as I understand sort of a LFG, HPSG view of the world, is actually very compatible with the LFG view of the world because it's all driven by the features on the elements in list one. I had some other thought about that, but I forget what it is. Oh yes, I was going to commend unto you the recent work of Asha Sudha and Dan Siddiqui and Paul Melchin, who are actually trying to operationalize an LFG view of a late insertion model. So they've been giving presentations on their revised LFG model that kind of incorporates particularly the late insertion piece into LFG, and don't seem to be running into any like fundamental conceptual roadblocks doing that. But yeah, it's a really good paper, a really interesting presentation. So.
Wonderful, thank you. So unsurprisingly, we do have a list of questions, but I'm actually going to deviate from the list ever so slightly just to poke a little bit more at the third list. So you're saying about the truth conditions. Could I ask how and if at all where pragmatics might come in then? If we've sort of got 1 and 3 being both sort of semantic, how that would work?
So it's actually interesting to wonder exactly how semantic 1 is. 1 might be just syntactic, and people thought of it as semantic because they couldn't conceive of any way to kind of make the system run without any idea of the semantic structure you're going for at the beginning of it. But certainly you don't need, so in the classic discrete morphology literature, the kind of information that is present in list 3 is called encyclopedic. And it corresponds to what psycholinguists or psychologists think of as semantics. You know, it's all of the stuff that tells you that colorless green ideas is oxymoronic, even though there's nothing sort of type theoretically wrong with it or sort of structurally wrong with it, it's fine. So list 3, which contains these kind of real world truth conditions, is very much an interface with some kind of conceptual level where you evaluate things in this kind of encyclopedic world knowledge kind of a way. I would say that distributive morphology, so distributive morphology has thought a lot about the interface between syntax, semantics, and morphology. We have not thought a ton about the interface between all of that and pragmatics. So I would say that probably the kind of syntactic, semantic, pragmatic work that has really exploded in the last few years that people approach from a minimalist perspective, I think that would be the place I would start to kind of answer that question. In terms of like the kinds of questions that I think are very hard to answer for me so far are like how these kind of ideas about competition and implicature work in this model. Like if you know you have a form that realizes plural in the normal case, and then so like just to take a very probably not appropriate example, if you look at the difference between worse and badder, right? So this is sort of a famous case where you have a normal comparative form of good that is suppletive, and you have a normal comparative form of bad that is suppletive, and then you have like the regular comparative form of bad that is not suppletive. You choose the non-suppletive allomorph to realize that. So you have bad, worse in the normal run of things when you want to say more bad, and you have bad, badder when you have the special allomorph that means something like, all of the things I can think of to realize this meaning are idioms, but like sick or cool or weird, or, you know, just the niftiest guy is the baddest guy. You could think of, I think that maybe people who approach this, I'm making this up completely. I think that maybe people who approach the world from some pragmatic grace and implicature point of view might think of that failure of realization of the worst stem as an implicature based kind of a thing. Like you didn't choose the normal form, instead you chose the regular form, and then by implicature you could say, well, the normal form is competing with the regular form. If the speaker had wanted to express normal bad, they would have chosen worse. They didn't choose worse, so they chose bad. So that by implicature, I can rule out all of those worse truth conditions. I'm going to look for another set of truth conditions. None of that has any place in the theory at the moment that I can. So that sort of the only way that I could think of to model that procedure, and there is some literature on these kinds of questions, is to say you've got 2 items in list 1. You have the bad item, which means sick or cool or whatever. You have the other bad item, which means bad. Neither of them have any phonological material. They have some index. 25 is one and 683 is another. And if you pick one, you're saying badder. And if you pick the other one, you're saying worse at the end of the derivation. If there was some kind of way to model the implicature-based discovery of the appropriate set of truth conditions in that world, I don't know what it is. It would have to happen at the sort of lexical selection stage at the beginning of the derivation. So basically, I don't know is the answer to that, but I can talk for a long time.
So I might sneak in a question of my own later too. But what happens to the distinction between inflectional morphology and derivational morphology in DM?
It doesn't exist. So you have conditioned realization of items, both on the semantic side and the phonological side. Sticking to the phonological side, since that's the place where you think about inflection versus derivation the most. Basically, there is a concept in minimalism called, that discrete morphologists have made a lot of use of, called the phase, which is some kind of chunking idea about how the syntactic derivation takes place. So you don't work with your whole set of sentential elements at once, you work with chunks. So the interaction between that kind of idea of building the structure in chunks and the idea that conditioning is local. So if you have a special morphophonological item, it is going to tell you, I am the item for this feature in any context. I am the item for this feature in the following set of special contexts. I am the item for this feature in this particular, quite large, very special context. It only occurs once. It's a little sort of morphological hapax legomena or something. If you sort of just think of it in terms of the likelihood that you are going to be conditioned by something, you're going to be conditioned by elements that are close to you in the morphological hierarchy and the syntactic structure, before you're going to be conditioned by elements that are far away from you. So the sort of likelihood that a special form is going to emerge is just sort of by happenstance, or by the way the model is set up, dependent on how local and close to the root you are. And sort of that inflection derivation divide, that productive unproductive divide, that compositional non-compositional divide, all of those things tend to correlate with how close you are to the root. So in the theory, you have this idea that there are little categorizing heads that can change the category of things that would change the category of a form that they attach to. Those would normally be classed as derivational morphology. And you have these kind of elements that contribute, quote, grammatical information, agreement, number, mood, tense, these kinds of things. You would normally classify them as inflectional morphology. Well, guess what? The ones that recategorize stuff are typically a lot closer to the root than the ones that contribute the sort of tense information or number information. And so the recategorizers have these properties that you attribute to derivational morphology. They're irregular more often, they're gappier more often, they do this category changing work, and they also are semantically special very often. That's because in the terms of the way the hierarchy is set up and the way the model puts meanings together, those category changing elements are closer to the root in the structure than the sort of more inflectional elements that are farther away from the root. So just in general, you expect more derivational properties to cluster on those kinds of morphemes that occur low in the structure for probably purely semantic reasons, really. You can't, or syntactic reasons, you can't recategorize something that's already got a bunch of, tense marking on it, unless you're a South American language or something like that. And similarly, you can't inflect something for tense that's got like a nominalizer on it. So just in terms of the way the sort of interpretive component has to work, those kinds of elements have to be farther from the root. Those kinds of elements are less likely to be subject to idiosyncratic things. And as usual, that sort of set of properties that people associate with derivational versus inflectional elements, those set of properties are fluid. So you can find perfectly regular derivational morphology. Participle forming elements like ing in English are usually good examples. You can find highly irregular inflectional morphology like tense or number. Even in terms of interpretation, those things can be irregular. So if you think about pluralia tantum in English, they are interpretively very irregular, even though they're sort of morphosyntactically quite regular. So there isn't any hardcore divide. The whole system works the same way from the bottom up. But there's this cluster of properties that seem to go with being close and other cluster of properties that seem to go with being far that have motivated this inflectional derivational divide. Now, that said, I haven't yet mentioned the role that this chunking property, this phases property plays. Several people have proposed that all conditioning can only pay attention to within phase elements. So if your syntax is being built up in chunks, and you have some kind of irregular conditioning on either list 2 or list 3 element, that conditioning can only look at the structure that it's in. And the structure that it's in is its phase. So people have made a lot of hay, including me, out of this idea that there are these sort of boundary layers in the derivation, such that you've got what Ramchan calls the first phase syntax. And within that, you get idiomaticity, morphological irregularity, yada, yada, yada. And as soon as you pass that chunk off to the interfaces and go on to your next phase, nothing that happened in that first phase can be dependent on something that's happened in the next phase. So you have this kind of gradient idea of closer and farther that gives you more derivational and more inflectional kinds of properties. And then you also have this sort of draw the veil kind of moment in the derivation, which might give you a very hardcore line between conditioned, irregular, idiosyncratic stuff and regular, perfectly regular stuff that might also correspond to another idea about the derivation inflection divide. I think it's kind of, because the notion of phase is a moving target and it had a long decade or so of intense investigation. I think people are not investigating phases quite as much as they used to do. So I suspect that, so for example, there's a famous proposal within distributive morphology from Maya Arad in 2002, particularly about Semitic roots, that said, within a categorizing phase, you have all kinds of weird semantic flexibility. As soon as you get outside it, it's 100% regular. Everybody sees the perfection of the crystal building combinatoric system once you're outside the first categorizing head. Then there was a cottage industry for a little while, which I see that David Bezetsky and Esther Rezin and Omer Preminger have just jumped on this bandwagon and got into the let's beat up on Arad corner. That basically said, no, she was wrong to draw such a hard line. You see idiosyncratic interpretations outside the first categorizing head. You see regularity inside the first categorizing head. There's no hard line. There's no sort of phasal boundary there. So anyway, people have tried to sort of have it both ways and have both a kind of gradient difference between inflection and derivation. Also, somewhere in the derivation, you get this hard line that you might call a categorical difference that you could call the inflection derivation difference. But anyway, we've got a few different ways to slice the pie there, but there's no sort of principle like in LFG. There's a big difference, I think, between the sort of word forming stuff that gives you new triples and then the inflectional stuff, which is you don't figure it out until after the syntax is over. There's no such spot in distributive morphology that says these guys are built in a completely different way than these guys.
Thank you, that's really interesting. The next question sort of tied into something you've already been talking about, which is roots and categories. But as opposed to just asking you, so what are roots, what are categories, because I feel like you covered that quite clearly. I was wondering if you could maybe give us some examples from English. I don't really study English very much, so I'm struggling to think of some examples in English. Yeah, just wondering if you could give us some of those.
So my favorite go-to examples are a bunch of the English that is borrowed from Romance, because it's super clear in those cases. You could fight about how synchronically real these distinctions are. I have various syntactic arguments that in fact they are quite synchronically relevant. And there's lots of cues in the input for the learner to pick up on them. But if you think of the sort of Latinate roots like sieve or pact or, form, whatever, that occur in these sort of quasi-paradigmatic sets of lexical items, conceive, receive, perceive, and, whatever some other sieve words are, deceive. There's lots of morphophonological irregularities that the learner can pick up on to indicate that the sieve element is a piece. The thing that they're famous for is there aren't any semantic regularities that tell you that the sieve element is a piece, right? So people tend to think we're going to treat just receive as a monomorphemic piece. But you can't treat receive as a monomorphemic piece. You have to treat it as re plus sieve, because the sieve root, the stem of those forms, has an allomorphic element, sept, in nominalizations that recurs in all of them: inception, deception, reception, conception. And so if the learner recognizes that sieve and sept are in an allomorphic relationship, and if allomorphy is implemented by sort of by competition at the late insertion moment, am I going to be realized as sieve or am I going to be realized as sept? Look at my environment, see which one is going to pop out. Then sieve has to have its own identity. And that identity is the identity of a semantically underspecified root. So you get the sieve element, and then its truth conditions are determined by looking around the structure. Am I next to D? Am I next to con? Am I next to re? Am I next to in? Actually, in yeah. Anyway, there's gappiness. Blah, blah, blah. And similarly, its phonology is going to be determined by looking around. Am I next to a verbalizer? Am I next to a nominalizer? Am I going to be sieve? Am I going to be sept? So in terms of the kind of notion of a root as an underspecified but lexical, in the sort of sense of rich lexical stem sense of lexical element, those Latinate roots are a good example in English. There's plenty of evidence that the learner has to pay attention to them as individual morphosyntactic doodads. There's lots of evidence they don't have any semantics of their own. They need to be in a structure and have conditioned semantic interpretation. So those are kind of canonical roots in the sort of distributed morphology sense that make the case that you don't want to give them phonology, you don't want to give them semantics, you want to just let the structure tell you. That said, every single encyclopedic element of a language has a root. Most of them are going to be in English or in any isolating language. Most of them are going to be morphologically invariant. So it doesn't matter whether you have chair as a verb or chair as a noun. It's going to be pronounced chair. You're going to have quite different semantic interpretations depending on what the syntactic environment is. Am I next to a verbalizer? Am I next to a nominalizer? Most lexical items are going to have a most frequent syntactic context. So chair is probably prototypically in its nominal context. So you're going to think of chair as having a independent default semantics. So you're not going to see this kind of variation that really motivates the idea of root in DM in most of our Germanic things, because they are from a fairly, isolating analytic piece of vocabulary. That said, you do see some kinds of cases where you think it's probably the same root, but weird things are happening that let you see some kind of allomorphic, semantic variation, correlation. I have this theoretical linguistics article, not to plug it too hard, from 2014, where I talk a lot about my ideas about how roots work. In there, there's a reply from Carlos Oregui and Andrew Nevins that talks about the challenge of the English term set of terms, person and people. So person, people has got, you know, a plural conditioned allomorph in its sort of basic sense that takes you from person to people in the conditioned allomorphy way. But each of person and people they each have their own senses. People has a verbal sense, and it has a sort of a tribal sense, or verbal sense is probably derived from the tribal sense. And in that context, it's got totally regular pluralization. So, or alternatively, you know, verbal inflection. So the continent was peopled, the peoples of the Americas, blah, blah, blah. And that now your person, people allomorphy has gone away, a little bit like the bad worse case that I was talking about earlier. Similarly, persons shows up. Persons is not a bad form in any sense. It's just got this very constrained semantic interpretation or context that it is used in that has to do with the individual as a body, as a physical person. So you have the Missing Persons Bureau, and that's also not morphophonologically ill-formed. It's just that you've got a specialized version of person. So there's some kind of common root to all of those things. And then they've got these very specific contextual interpretive conditions on them that have to do with particular, Carlos and Andrew argue, derivational morphology that they, go on, I'm in a meeting, sweetie, that they connect with. So the sort of, there you could think of a nominalizer that gives you the tribal sense of people that attaches to that root. And then you could think of sort of a default nominalizer that gives you normal count noun sense of people, and similarly for the persons kind of thing. I hope that's illustrative enough. If you really want to see roots in action, you go work on Semitic languages, and then things become very clear.
This might be where I sneak in my question then, as to more specifically how we individuate roots, or how much we expect to see them sort of stay the same across languages. The motivation for this is sort of in a verb like kill. Is that a root die merging with a causative, or is that its own root? How do we find out which ones are atomic and which ones aren't?
So I love this question. I have strong opinions about it, but other people also have strong opinions about it. So I tend to think, and we can see this sort of morphologically, kill is a great case, but let's set that one aside for the moment. Let's look at blush cross-linguistically. So if you look at blush in English, it looks like an unergative root. It's got a nominal counterpart, one's blush or the blush. It seems to have unergative syntax, seems to look like the underlying structure of blush is kind of, in English, is kind of like do a blush. And there's, various kinds of evidence for that in the input. Probably the best evidence is the noun verb counterpart there. Also intransitivity, also a couple other things. The fact that this is negative evidence, of course, so it's very hard to say how to interpret this, but the fact that blush in English doesn't have a passive adjective, which unaccusative roots typically do. So there's no the blushed boy, meaning the boy who has blushed, right? Or who is blushed. You contrast that with something like Italian, arrossire, which is literally a red verb, right? It says, and it seems to have an accusative structure means something like become red. It participates in all the unaccusative, syntactico-morphological tricks that Italian does with its unaccusative intransitives. If you're trying to translate between Italian and English, you have to use adocere in Italian, where you would use blush in English, and vice versa. But if I'm right, the sort of syntactic, morphosyntactic structure that underlies those two forms is quite distinct. So you can't say that there's a single underlying root concept that exists in the linguistic system for those two words, right? The Italian one is based on some kind of root that means red. The English one is based on some kind of emission of blushed color, blushedness. It's like a verb of emission somehow or other. And yet they express very similar kinds of underlying concepts. When I think of those kinds of questions, you I'm sure have read all of those Fodorian things about eggs being addled in English versus eggs being spoilissimoed. So English has this special lexical item, addle, that only applies to eggs and brains. And if you're going to say the similar thing in in some language like Italian, you have to use just the word for spoiled. And these kinds of issues are a challenge for a strongly Fodorian innatist idea about conceptual availability. If we're all born with doorknobs or not, right? Certainly, Fodor and any human being would agree that we have to be all born with the potential for doorknobs or addled or blushing. But your linguistic input, if you are growing up in Italian, doesn't give you the individuation criteria you need to identify and fix on that concept as one of your fundamental pieces of your language of thought, in my humble opinion. As soon as you get such evidence, you get it. It's no problem, right? So there's for me anyway, there's a complicated interaction between the linguistic environment that you're in and the kind of process of reification of concepts. To go back to your original question about kill versus causality, there are plenty of languages where the linguistic system gives you tons of evidence that the word that you use in the kill context is built out of two pieces, cause and die. English doesn't give you that morphological realization, that morphological transparency piece. It also doesn't give you a couple of cute syntactic cues that English would give you to tell you that the underlying root in kill is the sort of become dead part, right? That's not to say, so I tend to think, based on what I understand about English morphosyntax, that kill is its own root in English, and that kill and cause to die are not super connected to each other in English. To go back to my nominalization example, there's a kill as an event nominal of English. It's sort of like a blush that tells you that kill falls into the same sort of morphosyntactic group as push or pull or blush with the agent and blah, blah, blah. On the other hand, if you're in a language like Japanese, you see the word for kill is made out of cause to die. There's a die root that's clearly in there, both morphologic, that's written on its sleeve. God is telling you killing is causing to die in your input. So you're going to sort of reify that concept in that way. That said, there are plenty of concepts that are common to the human experience that are probably going to get lexicalized cross-linguistically in totally parallel ways. So, this sort of Swedish list of concepts that you can probably find monomorphemic words for in any language that you go to. And I don't see any reason to think that those are reifying distinct concepts in English or French or Japanese or Hyaki or whatever language. They're probably exactly the same. let's see, I had some other rant to go on with regard to that. I don't know. Anyway, yeah. So I don't know how super clear all of that was, but that's kind of where I'm coming from with those questions.
No, that's fair. That's really interesting. It's also lovely to hear different examples from other languages. Obviously, we don't really know who's going to be watching this, so I'm sure at least someone is going to be thinking, "Oh, yes, I see that now from their native language," which is always great.
I think one of the languages I speak has the causative just applied to die. So, yeah.
To die. Yep. So, I mean, it's a very common way to lexicalize that concept cross-linguistically. Fodor made a big meal out of it back in the early 70s because of the sort of generative semantics debate that was going on. But I think to a certain extent, it might have been wasted effort because the morphological structure of English is quite different with respect to that particular one. That said, oh yeah, I remember what I was going to say. So I do think that there are monomorphemic words of English that are causatives of other monomorphemic words of English that would be the kind of thing that Fodor should have spent his effort on. The best example that I think I have is the sort of teach-learn thing. I think teach is probably a causative of learn. Cross-linguistically it is. Within English, there are tons of dialects that use learn in a causative sense. I'm going to learn you. And I think that probably there's enough evidence that those two concepts are tightly connected to each other in the input, that the child is able to posit suppletive stem teach is causative of suppletive stem learn. Anyway, that's my example from English that he should have worked on instead of kill.
That's fab, thank you. Yeah, no, one of the languages I speak is Dutch, and you can have leren and aanleren, but also you can have just leren, so you can have an extra bit in there to double check that you know it means one rather than the other, but it's all a bit flexible. I had another question actually, which you've sort of touched on a little bit, and sorry if I'm getting you to repeat yourself here. Do we see a great difference, or is there a great difference discussed within DM between agglutinating and isolating languages, or are they handled on a pretty similar basis?
They are handled on a very similar basis. So your first guess about the underlying structure for any language is going to look the same, whether it's agglutinating or isolating, or like you're going to have this kind of, not that the M people are necessarily, universal spine people or anything like that, but we've got lots of evidence across languages that, within the verbal domain, you've got a root, you've got a verbalizer, and you've got a voice element, and then various kinds of inflectional things on top of that. And if you were just going to pick a random sentence from a random language, you would start, whether it was isolating, agglutinating, or what, you would start with that structure and see how far it would get you. What's really great, and I feel very happy about this in terms of sort of not having wasted my entire career, is that it's a good first pass nearly all the time. I haven't run into a language where I thought, oh yeah, I don't see the piece that is the root, and I don't see the piece, I see those pieces, whether they're morphemes within the agglutinating string or whether they're independent pieces in the sort of syntactic hierarchy. You kind of recognize the family resemblance across language types. The question about whether a language type is going to package all of that material into something that is a morphophonologically one word, or is not going to do that and is just going to string them all out as independent phonological words, that's where all of the sort of sleight of hand in the morphological component comes in. So if you see a language that moves its verbs to the left and has everything lined up in a nice agglutinating way, maybe prefixally, then you're going to do all the work to morph your syntactic structure into something like that on the morphological side of the component. So you'll have a model that starts from the same base, whether you're isolating or agglutinating, and then you'll do a lot of sort of extra work to make the algorithm take you to the right surface form.
Fabulous.
And I think we're more or less on our last question but has been touched on already. But so it looks like something that's atomic at the semantic level isn't necessarily that way at the syntactic level. So is it that roots and their categorizers and so on, that's what's fed into semantic interpretation as a basic unit of interpretation?
No. So again, this is now me, not like distributed morphology as a general block. I think that roots are unitary both on the syntactic and semantic level. So there is an idea of an atom. I don't think we're born with all our atoms. I think we learn them. But the root is the nucleus that, Fodor was talking about. And it has a unique semantic interpretation and a unique morphological realization typically. The trick that the sleight of hand is involved in saying what's a unique semantic realization, since we have this idea that the semantic realization can be kind of allomorphic, allosemic, if you will. Then you can have a root that has a set of allosemic representations in different contexts of different sizes. And those allosemic representations are atoms in the Fodorian sense. So the root has them, that's the atom, but you only see, one of them in a particular context with like 5 other morphological pieces in the environment. So it looks like a multimorphemic thing has an atomic interpretation, but it doesn't. Instead, the root has the atomic interpretation in the context of yada, yada, yada. You might think that that is a sort of splitting hairs way of thinking about things, but I think it's actually conceptually pretty important. It does enable us to sort of pin all that bad behavior on the root, sort of in a model, in terms of the model, and take it as an axiom that that's the way the human language system works. It looks for these kind of nuclei, it ascribes weird shit to them, and the sort of morphosemantic, morphosyntactic superstructure is not involved in that. So in terms of the language concept interface, we get to sort of pin it in the model entirely on the root, not say, oh, there's big chunks of structure with internal complexity that map onto monomorphemic elements. That's not to say that reanalysis is not a real thing, right? So diachronically, some generation is going to pick up on this thing that historically was morphophonologically, morphosyntactically complex and say, that's my root. And then, say, well, if that's the root, then that's the atom, blah, blah, blah. So you might end up sort of diachronically with pieces that look internally complex in some historical sense, but that are synchronically monomorphemic. So reanalysis is a real thing, but as a kind of axiom of my way of thinking about the world, all of those things are, you should attach them to the root instead of to the bigger structure. That's another sort of sense in which there's like, in fact, I'm supposed to be writing a piece about structure dependent meaning. I don't even know how I'm going to write this, but anyway, it's mainly going to be a long screed about how construction based approaches are all wrong, and we have to think of things in terms of roots.
Wonderful. Well, we've sort of come to the end of our questions. So I suppose if there's anything that you would like to leave us with, any last moments, any last sort of thoughts?
Well, thank you guys. This has been a very, very stimulating discussion and of great interest. I guess my thought is that when you come to any new framework from some other set of assumptions, it's very challenging to kind of take it on its merits, like to kind of go to that framework, look at how it works internally, and not think this is crazy. We know axiom X from your original framework is true. That's true for anybody coming at anything from another framework. What I would invite people to do is to sort of take a derivation from beginning to end, understand how it happens, take it for granted. I try to do when I look at other work from other frameworks, that everything that looks like a piece of nonsense from your perspective actually had some motivation. Like it wasn't nonsense from the point of view who made it. So some things were nonsensical, that look nonsensical from the outside, have good internal motivations in terms of the framework that you're working in. When you kind of see where all the pieces that look like nonsense are, then you go and you try to understand, well, what's the motivation for that in the theory? Then you have a pretty good picture of why people do things the way they do in this theory and why people do things the way they do in your home theory. And you can sort of make an apples to apples comparison at that point and kind of see where the wins and losses are. So that's my sort of moral for the discussion. But anyway, language is fun.
Yeah, it really is. And again, it's great for us to hear about different approaches and everything, and I'm sure everybody listening is thinking the same, because we're not always exposed to the same schools of thought. So it's been super interesting, and obviously we're very lucky to have you talk to us today. So thank you so much for spending your time. So a massive thank you from myself and Mal, and hope everybody who's been watching has thoroughly enjoyed this. I know that I have, and I know that Mal has as well. I can see that on his face. And just thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much, you guys. I'm honored to be part of your series, and great idea for a series.
Our pleasure.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.